It seems like this regime just hates Israel, hates America. Like, what are they trying to do?
Well, again, it's the exportation of an ideology, and one of the components is to create as many proxies so they're not directly focused on. It's a little bit like interesting you in fighting the tentacles rather than the eye of the octopus. That's number one. Number two, part of their strategy is to create an element of regional instability that works in their advantage, antagonizing regional governments, whether it's the Saudis or having a hand in Lebanon or in Iraq or elsewhere. The proxy war is one way for them to get as much credit without being accountable and answerable directly. All of this is part of this strategy that they have adopted all these years. But obviously, this is a complete different viewpoint from the people of Iran. And as you mentioned, especially during this recent campaign of Women, Life, Freedom, we saw that in many demonstrations on the streets of Europe and elsewhere, Iranians were marching together with Israelis or Jews with the Iranian flag and the Jewish flag in complete, conflict.
It's amazing. We're sharing a lot of values.
Absolutely.
And when the U.S., and you tell me if this is not appropriate to ask, but when the U.S. tries to make decisions on foreign policy and Trump assassinates Soleimani, or when Israel assassinates the leading Iranian generals who are supporting these terror activities, obviously, as a leader of a country, you don't want your people killed. But if these are bad guys, part of a bad regime, is that appropriate for people to be, eliminating those players, or how do we think about that?
Well, I mean, it's the unfortunate consequence of a regime that has been fomenting terrorism, among other things. And when it gets ugly, obviously, we can see these kind of consequences as a byproduct. Hence, more reason to say, look, you can eliminate all of this by changing the nature of what is governing a country. It means liberating a country from a regime that never cared for Iran to begin with. That's what Khomeini said. Yeah. Let's not forget. After 15 years in exile, I think it was an Italian journalist that asked Khomeini on the plane as he was flying back to Tehran, what are your sentiments of returning to Iran after 15 years in exile? The answer was one word, nothing. That's what he said. I don't care. I'm going to use Iran and its resources to launch my revolution and exporting this modern day Shiite caliphate all the way to the shores of the West, starting with the immediate region. That was the mindset back then. And that's the part that I don't think many administrations here, or for that matter in Europe, really understood how serious this could get. Mm-hmm. Because I remember in the early 80s when I was talking to British parliamentarians or French diplomats or American congressmen or what have you, they were thinking, okay, this is a regional thing. It's a fight between, Muslims in that area. How could we be possibly affected by it? But look at how far it has reached. Yeah. Islamic radicalism has already penetrated many borders in the Western world. And that's part of a problem, among other things.
So 45 years later, there's, Khomeini's still there, obviously. He has the mullahs around him. They have the Revolutionary Guard. Like, how big is the ruling group right now? Like, if people wanted to remove the ruling group, like, what does that consist of? How hard is that to do regime change there?
Well, imagine that you have this huge tent with Khamenei as the main pillars. And under this tent, there's a sort of a symbiosis of a mafia-like military paramilitary group that benefits from economic privileges and a whole host of people directly or closely associated with that top-ranking element that basically are dividing the country among themselves. And
these guys are taking the spoils all between
they just control every aspect. But as much as they might be in control, they are also very much in conflict. And I think that at some point in time when Khamenei is no longer around,
people might fight over it.
We're going to see even more of that.
Interesting.
So the regime is far more fragile than everybody thinks it is at this point. So I think understanding cleverly that there will be a point, and history has proven to all of us that ultimately totalitarian system cannot survive. The question is when, as opposed to whether or not they will continue to exist. But I think it's important that the world so far has confronted critical elements by directly getting involved in putting an end to something. Best example I can use is the example of putting an end to Nazism during the Second World War. And you had strong leadership in Washington and in Britain. You had Roosevelt and you had Churchill. Then it came an era where the Soviet Union had to come into an end, and you had a strong leadership in the form of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. Today, we're talking about a change that it's an internal change, but it needs support. It goes back to my argument about we need to maximize support to the Iranian people. But behind that policy has to be strong leadership, decisive leadership. You cannot, on the one hand, expect Iran to change by almost be appeasing and giving more money rather than to the people, to a regime that's going to spend it on even more.
If you appease a bad regime, it doesn't make it better.
Of course, it's been proven.
I have another historical question actually for you. I'm curious if you don't mind me asking. So I'm a founder of Palantir, is one of my companies that, I've worked with a lot of the global intelligence people, especially U.S. and allies. And one of my mentors ran British intelligence and was involved before the Iraq war in the U.S. And he tells me that the Iranians are very, very clever, the regime, and certain people there. And he says that he believes from the best intelligence he saw that they helped trick the U.S. leaders into thinking there were more WMDs in Iraq because they were worried that U.S. might have gone after them instead. And they knew that if we went into Iraq, we'd get bogged down and we wouldn't bother them. At the time, should the U.S. maybe have gone after the mullahs instead? Or was there any reason? Was there any excuse to do that at the time? And do you think that's something Iran could have possibly done? Is that? I know you don't have the data, but is that a theory of something that they would be smart enough to do?
Well, I think, as I explained to you before, understanding that the root cause of this entire regional mayhem is directly tied to the emergence of this regime in the first place, because everything else that you see as a consequence was as a result of the revolution in Iran and a regime that brought in every aspect that led to radicalism and what have you. On the other hand, we had events that somehow propelled America to get involved. The same way that had it not been for Pearl Harbor, would America been involved in the Second World War? In a way, what happened in 9/11 propelled a campaign of getting engaged in Afghanistan and later on Iraq. But all of this is to say that while at the time it was putting an end to, and particularly the scenario of Iraq, which was an argument for regime change, which happened, but the way it was handled gave the name regime change a bad reputation. What I've been arguing is that regime change is still the solution. Just because you didn't,
just because you messed it up
properly,
one time,
that doesn't mean that it's the wrong concept. Particularly if it is the ask of the people there.
Yes.
You are basically addressing that. So either you say, look, we can either hope that yet again we can cut some kind of a deal with a regime that has never been honest, that has always been non-transparent, and with ill intentions, or we can trust a nation that say, hey, liberate, help us be free, and you will see that our values, our aspirations, our interests are one and the same. And it's only a win-win scenario that you can anticipate out of it.
It seems to me it's too bad that Bush and Cheney and Rice didn't do this with Iran 20 years ago. Might have been better for everyone.
Well, I don't think anybody was truly ready back at the time. I must be honest with you. I think that a lot of change had to occur, particularly inside Iran, in sense of, well, how much this expectation of gradual change or reform actually will pay off, because this reform game has been the key argument for diplomats in the West of saying, well, some of them are more hawkish, some of them are more moderate. Maybe we should allow the moderates to gain more traction by helping them as opposed to the more hawkish ones. They even said that at the time of the Soviet Union. Some people said, Andropov is more moderate than Chernenko. Why? Well, he likes jazz music and drinks whiskey. Oh, is that your indication of more moderation? Well, in a way, it may sound funny, but actually when they looked at Mohammad Khatami at the time, or for instance, other so-called moderates in Iran, people in Iran are way past that. They say, you know what? The problem is fundamentally the nature of the system, that you cannot bring change by means of legislation or people's having free election.
You can't vote these guys out right now.
No, exactly.